Hi, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Eye on Oshkosh. I'm your host, Cheryl Hentz. Very pleased to welcome to the show tonight someone who's not been on before, but we certainly hope this will not be his last appearance here. Very happy to welcome Eric Sparr, who is the current Winnebago County District Attorney, to the show. Hi, thanks for being here.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, we've got lots of good stuff to talk about tonight. We kind of talked a little bit about it already, and we're going to cover a boatload of stuff for you guys, so hang tight. So I guess first, why don't you tell folks a little bit about yourself, where you, if you're from here originally, where you went to school, how long you've been in the legal profession, how you got your start in law, that kind of thing.
Sure. I'm from Oshkosh, graduated from Oshkosh West.
Great school.
Yeah, I went to UW-Madison. Did my undergrad there. My undergrad degree is computer engineering, so this was not the plan.
Yeah.
I was maybe my third year of college and realized I wasn't really ever going to enjoy that, and made the decision to go to law school, which it was definitely the right call in retrospect. Stayed in Madison for law school, so I was there for 7 years, and then came back here after that. Actually, I interned in the DA's office here after my second year of law school. And
oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, really didn't appreciate that I was setting myself up to come back. That was 2004.
And especially to come back and run the office.
Well, that took a little while, yeah. But 2005 came back full time, and I've been there ever since.
Okay. So you started out then in the office. When you came back full time, you started out as an assistant DA?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because a deputy DA is one notch higher than assistant DAs, right?
Yeah, so there's the DA is an elected or appointed position. Then there's a deputy DA. When I started, we had 8 assistant DAs. We now have 10. So there were a number of positions added all around the state approximately 5 years ago. And so we've been anywhere from 10 to 12 in the time I've been here. Those positions haven't always been full, and that's probably a good thing to get into later, but we have 12 total lawyer positions, so 10 assistants, DA and deputy DA.
Okay. All right. Well, so let's talk about your term. Christian Gossett was our former DA, and he left mid-term in his, it's a 4-year term, right?
Correct.
So he left partway through, and so you were appointed then.
Right. So
by the governor.
Yep, that was May. I took office May of last year.
Okay. Well, how's it been so far?
I think I knew what I was getting into. I mean,
it's kind of a loaded question, Eric.
Yeah. Well, I think more than some people that get into these positions, I knew what it was going to be like because I had been there.
Yeah.
I'd been in the office at that point for 17 years approximately, and had been the deputy DA for the 2 years preceding that. So there weren't too many surprises.
Yeah.
But there are always little things. But
sure.
I knew what it was all about.
And it is, isn't it? It's so different looking at it from a few steps back instead of looking at it when you're right smack dab in the middle. And you've got to be the one making those decisions. And you've got to be the one figuring out how to balance the budget and the resources within your office. And, so you can look at it for as many years as you want, but boy, when you're thrown into the middle of that, it's got to be a little bit mind-numbing at first, isn't it?
Yeah, I think one of the big changes for me was that, especially when I was an assistant DA, I kind of got to pick and choose what I got involved with. If I had a real passion about something, then I got involved. Otherwise, I probably didn't really have to deal with it. And as I went into the deputy position, and especially the DA position, then you have to be involved in everything.
Yeah.
And so that was the challenge. Now I was dealing with things I didn't have as much expertise in, but was still kind of on the hook for them.
Sure. So you were appointed by the governor. When is it up?
So end of next year. So
Okay.
end of 24. Election is fall of 24.
Okay. And you plan to run again?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, that was. I think that was kind of a commitment that was being made when I took this over. It's having frequent changes in this kind of spot is not helpful for continuity and
Sure.
getting things done. So definitely that was the plan when I got into this.
Yeah. So what, you're going to get asked this next year and, probably early in the year since the election is, in the fall. But what would you say as of right now if someone were to say, okay, Mr. Sparr, what do you consider to be some of the accomplishments that you've made? What have you contributed to the office so far? What would you say if someone asked you that today, as I am today?
Sure. I think, well, I mean, it goes back even further. And for the way that our office is run, it's not everything is controlled by one person. Mm-hmm. So I think we recognize that different people have different areas of expertise. So even people that are in positions that are not formal leadership positions end up getting involved in things that in some places would be reserved for people that are in those formal leadership positions. So even when I was an assistant, I was very involved in especially substance abuse things, but some other areas as well. And so I had already been putting programs into place from that position. Mm-hmm. And then going into the other positions that got me involved in other things. But I think one of the things for me, our office was in pretty good shape to begin with. So I wasn't walking into something that was just a disaster, or I guess some offices have went down to very few or no lawyers, and so some people coming into these positions were trying to fill their offices. I didn't really have that problem. We were down people occasionally, but it was never a catastrophic situation. And so really it was about maintaining things and there were some things that I did want to make changes about. There were some relationships I think that had to be mended, and that was probably the biggest project for me coming in. Mm-hmm. was to get those things in order and making sure that everybody in the system was working together. So law
Sure.
enforcement and our office and the other players that are involved in our cases that aren't necessarily directly involved in the criminal justice system, but for example, human services or some organizations that provide services to people that we're dealing with.
Mm-hmm. I don't want to delve into this too much because I know that there possibly are some personnel things there, but when you say relationships that needed to be mended, can you just tell us generally what you mean by that?
Yeah, so our office certainly is thoughtful about what we put into the court system, and what that means is I think in some prosecution offices the approach is if there's a factual basis for it, it gets charged, and we'll deal with the rest of it later. And for a long time we have taken the view and recognized that even charging a case has an impact on somebody's life and can have a significant negative impact, even if a person is not convicted. So we have always tried to be thoughtful about what we're putting in the system, about what we do with those cases once we do put them in the system, mm-hmm. And thinking about ways to address issues without bringing people into the criminal justice system. So when we have that approach, that is not always exactly in line with what law enforcement would like to see.
Yeah.
For law enforcement, and I don't mean to, it's probably it's an overgeneralization, but they would like to see cases charge people into the system and what can happen from that.
Sure.
So anytime we're doing something that's not exactly that, it's going to potentially cause a disconnect. And I think that when I came in, I had a history of working very closely with law enforcement and doing a lot of cases with them. So it put me in a good place to really get them involved, in some cases involved with making policy, but also just to, I think, do a better job of explaining to them why we were doing some things that we were doing that didn't seem directly in line with what they would want.
Sure.
And I think we've had a lot of success with that. And,
well, that's good.
Some policies have changed too. And I had conversations with them, and they said, well, you guys haven't done this very well. And I said, oh, I agree. I think we can do better at that.
Yeah. Well, and also, I'm glad that you guys are really thoughtful about charging decisions, because once they're charged, it's out there in CCAP, and far too many. I think CCAP is a great thing.
Sure.
I do, but I also think that there are people who don't know how to use it really the way it's intended. They inadvertently misread information. They don't bother to follow through to look at the whole history of the case to see if it was dismissed, and if so, why it was dismissed, and that kind of thing. And so I think it's far too easy for some people to just say, oh, this person was charged with this, and then make decisions, whether hiring decisions or rental decisions or whatever, based on something like that, even though they're not supposed to. We know
Sure.
It happens. I mean, let's be real about things. So, and you can't really get it off CCAP once it's there, It takes an act of Congress, and even then I don't know if you can get it removed from CCAP. So I'm happy to hear that you are very cognizant about, charging decisions when you make them. I applaud your office for that.
Sure.
And you. What do you like most about the job?
I think the biggest thing for me when I got into prosecution, I had worked after my first year of law school, I worked at a program that worked with the federal prison in Oxford, Wisconsin. And then the second summer I was in prosecution. And I felt like I could have done either one and really enjoyed it. I think criminal law is far more interesting to me than a lot of other areas. So I knew right away I wanted to do that. And then for me, prosecution, when you decide what the appropriate outcome is, has generally less obstacles to getting there. So I think the idea that when you see what the appropriate outcome is, you aren't frustrated as often trying to get there.
Yeah.
And so that's really appealing, but also just being able to work so closely with other entities, which doesn't happen so much from the defense side. For prosecution, we're able to get a lot of other groups involved, that even some that traditionally haven't really been involved with the criminal court system, but it ultimately, I think, makes a lot of sense to have them there.
Sure. Explain for us, because this is something that I think is very confusing for people. You're called the Winnebago County District Attorney's Office, leading people to think, okay, it's a county entity, and yet part of your office, part of your budget is paid for by the county. Part of it is paid for by the state. You are not a county-appointed person. You are a state-appointed person, a governor-appointed, a gubernatorial appointment, if you will. So there's a lot of different entities happening there. So explain to us the difference between what part of your office is county-based and how much is state-based or funded.
Oh, and that's a really strange situation, because that's not common that there'd be both in the same office. So we have our 12 lawyers are state employees.
Okay.
So I am, and all of the other lawyers. Everybody else in my office essentially is a county employee. So we have about 30 people total, so about 18 non-lawyers. And that would be paralegals or investigators. We have a crime data analyst. We have a number of other positions, victim witness personnel. And those are all county employees. So one of the things that makes complicated is if we're looking for money for something or trying to get something approved, we sometimes have to go to two different entities to try to get that approval. Fortunately, we don't all that often ask for things like that. Usually, I mean, our budget is relatively simple because mostly it's just personnel. There are some things for programming types of things where we do have to request money, but it gets complicated then, and having state and county is tricky.
Yeah. How big is your budget?
Well, mostly it's personnel. We have a really small budget for other things, and actually a lot of that comes from grants, which are temporary. So like right now we have a couple of grants that are going on for programs that we wrote for. Looking at the two budgets together, I don't even know what it comes down to. We don't actually even have to deal with the budget at the state level. That's dealt with by our state office.
Okay.
Our salaries are set by the state. We don't really have too much direct influence over that.
So do you have any sense of what your total budget is, how much it costs to run your office, whether county or state?
Yeah, our county budget, I believe, is a little over $1 million. I think that does include some of the grants, so that money is really being covered by someone else anyway.
Okay.
That doesn't include the lawyers, though, and I don't know what the total number is for that. We don't get a nice, tidy summary of that.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Fair enough. Well, and see there again, because it's two different kind of budgets, really. That would be challenging. So how many more people could you use, whether it be assistant DAs or paralegals or investigators? How many more people could your office realistically use if money was not an object?
Sure. And that's a really interesting discussion, and it's been a discussion for many years all around the state. So when we went from 10 lawyers to 12, that was a really significant increase, and that allowed us to do some things that we couldn't have done before. And ultimately, I think with the way that we do things, put us in a pretty good position. One thing that I talked about, the charging decisions, and The other thing that we have done historically is said we need to prioritize things.
Yeah.
Sometimes I've seen lawyers in court before say, well, judge, this is a very important case, and we kind of joke that if you say that on every case, then no case is important because they're all the same.
Yeah.
And so I think that part of doing what we do is recognizing the reality that you do have to prioritize, that some cases are really important, and some, with the way the budget is, we can't really deal with all that. So we have at times categorically said, well, we just don't have the resources to do this. So for example, issuance of worthless checks. We had contracted those out to an outside agency to essentially put people through a financial class, pay the restitution, and if they did that, the cases didn't even come into our office to get charged. There are certain types of cases too that possession of marijuana cases, for example, over the last about year and a half, we made the decision that we're not charging those, and part of that was the emergence of Delta 8 THC and Delta 10 THC, which are essentially legal variations of Delta 9 THC, which is the illegal kind. Testing to distinguish between those became very expensive, and we just said that's not worth it. So categorically, we said, with very rare exception, we're not interested in charging these cases criminally. And so decisions like that do make it a little more realistic to focus on the things that we really do care about. Violent offenses, for example, and certain types of financial offenses that are hitting people really hard right now. And as things pop up, catalytic converter theft or things like that, financial abuse of vulnerable people.
Yeah.
It frees up time to be doing the things that we've decided we really do need to focus on, and that allows us to get done what we need to with the staff we have. Now, ideally, I guess if we had more people, could we do more with those cases that we have decided weren't as high of priorities? Then we could.
Yeah.
But I think we've adjusted to the reality of what we're facing right now. And because of that, we've really been able to pretty much keep up with the cases that are coming in.
Sure. So let's talk about marijuana for a little bit. How do you feel about the legalization of marijuana?
I think it seems inevitable at some point for Wisconsin. I think one of the problems right now is that we have these states bordering us where it has been legalized. Yeah. And that creates a real problem with enforcement, or a problem for people that are traveling through the state and not even really realizing what they're doing. So I think that with all the movement that's happened already, I think it's inevitable, and I think it at this point probably makes sense. If we were surrounded by states that didn't have it, I guess I wouldn't probably feel so strongly about it. But at this point, I think it's just going to happen, and I think that's going to simplify things.
Well, and I would like to see it, not because I don't believe it's a gateway drug, because I think it can be. The only reason I would like to see it is because all the other states around us are doing it, and you're right, it does make sense. People traveling through the state may not realize that we're a state where it's not legal. But, the other part of it is that it would be a lot less expense for you guys to try these cases. And because there's got to be a lot of them. That has to be one of the biggest things that law enforcement is out there doing, is trying to crack down on drugs. But also, here's probably the biggest reason why I would like to see it legalized, and that's, if you have it legalized, you can monitor the shops, you can tax the product, and by monitoring it, you can be assured, both law enforcement and the public, that the stuff coming out of there is not tainted or laced with something. We hear every day practically about fentanyl deaths and, simple drugs being laced with fentanyl. And that's, I think, a huger problem than just someone who's rolling and smoking a joint, So you've got better control over it, and therefore your public is, I think, going to be safer as a result.
Sure. Yeah.
Now, you've got this whole other aspect where, someone's going to get high and they're going to be out driving around just like people get drunk and drive. And granted, that's a problem that has to be looked at and addressed. But I just think when you weigh the two, I think one is going to outweigh the other a little bit. And that's just my layman's look at it. But, do you think that I'm thinking along the right terms here with that, or?
I think that's all fair, and like you say, there's a downside to almost anything that we're talking about too, and it's a matter of balancing Going back to what you had commented on too about just use of resources, when we made the change, and this is going back to what I was saying about interactions with law enforcement, we went to law enforcement and said, here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing it, and said essentially, if this makes you want to change how you do your enforcement, great. And that's part of why we want them to know that. And we've done that in a few other areas too. I guess I think back, and not to get away from the marijuana completely, but when we were changing policies on, we had age-based sexual assaults, for example. We have a 16-year-old and a 17-year-old in a relationship. We said we're not interested in making somebody a sex offender over that. And we went to law enforcement. Yeah. Well, we went, and this was probably 10 years ago, but went to law enforcement and I said, hey, here's what we're doing. So if this changes what you're doing, I want you to know what to expect so you're not wasting your time. And that might say, okay, well, we're not going to spend tens or how many hours investigating something to know that it's not going to go anywhere. And so there are exceptions, for sure. I mean, when I talk about age-based, when it becomes a disturbing gap, that's a different situation. But
right.
People who are relatively close in age, they're committing a whole bunch of violations if they're sexually interacting. And
potentially ruining a good chunk of their life as a result.
Yeah, but the thing for me has always been to go to law enforcement and say, here's what our approach is going to be. And now law enforcement is able to adjust how they allocate their resources. Mm-hmm.
And has that been working pretty well so far?
Yeah, and I think in a lot of these things, law enforcement has been on board with some of the changes. Even in, for example, the marijuana situation, I was nervous about whether that was going to upset law enforcement. We didn't hear too much about that.
Good.
So it's been relatively smooth for the most part with all of those changes that we've kind of gone to them with and said, here's what we're going to do.
You mentioned catalytic converter thefts. I just saw something, it came out of another state just yesterday about this, and I didn't look at it that closely. Now I wish I would. Now I wish I would have, Eric. But I mean, is this still a really big problem? It seems like it is.
Yeah, I think it still is, and there's some federal legislation that is out there. I think it has passed now, or it was at least proposed and had momentum, that is going to, for example, they have some things where they're going to be imprinting VIN numbers on catalytic converters. But that's new vehicles. And how long is it going to be before everything on the road is 2023 or newer? It's going to be a long time. So in the meantime, we have to look at what we can do at the local level, the county level, the state level. And we've struggled with that. It's one of those offenses where often there aren't witnesses to it. And so it requires a lot of investigative resources to potentially not even get to a chargeable case. But there have been some real successes for law enforcement, and we want to make sure that we're working closely with them on that too.
Talk real briefly about why this is such a big problem and what people can do to protect themselves, if anything.
Yeah, so it's really about the metals that are in the catalytic converters. So people will cut the catalytic converter off, take it to a place where they can get it broken down and get at the metal. And what they're getting is it's a lot of money for somebody that is in the business of breaking these down, but we're talking about maybe a couple $100 potentially, or a little bit less than that. And the repair cost is much more significant than that. So the repair cost for somebody who has this taken off is over $1,000. So someone is benefiting a relatively small amount and costing an innocent person a very significant amount of money. And so there are some devices that are out there. I guess if you Google search that, you'll come across some devices that are designed to try to mitigate that. But I think one of the big things is just being careful about where vehicles are being parked. If you have access to a camera that could keep an eye on it, to have that if your vehicle is parked outside. Closing and locking garage doors, for example, they're just normal things to secure property that you can do, I think are appropriate for that too. But ultimately, it's still something that is a big draw for people, and I think we've had some discussions about whether there are legislative changes that might decrease that desire for people to take them. And I don't know if there's not a magic bullet or something like that, but I think there are subtle changes.
There isn't for anything, it seems.
Yeah.
I was going to ask this a little bit further on, but since we're talking about people getting money from catalytic converter metals and things like that, what percentage of crime that takes place in Winnebago County would you estimate are crimes that are happening because of poverty and more people being in poverty these days than ever before.
That's a huge driver for a lot of this, especially property offenses. I mean, if a person has a lot of money, they're probably not breaking into somebody's house. They're not cutting off somebody's catalytic converter.
Right.
The other big categories are drug and alcohol abuse or mental health issues. And so the combination of those things, the money, the drug and alcohol, and the mental health, those are driving almost all of the crime. Wow. And it's hard. A lot of times these things are overlapping, and people have issues in multiple areas and more than one of those categories. So it's difficult to say some people have all of those issues.
Yeah.
So which one was really the cause? But it's almost everything goes back to those things. And speaking specifically about the money, I think there are certain types of offenses where we might see people that have money committing them. Drunk drivings, for example. People with money, people without money commit drunk drivings. Domestic violence incidents, those occur for people with money or without money. But certain categories are way less common for people that have money.
Now, how many cases does your office, on average, and I know it varies from year to year, varies from month to month and week to week, but on average, how many cases would you say your office handles in a year's time?
We're usually approaching about upwards of 3,000, probably closer to 4,000. So when we have our 12 lawyers, and the average caseload is somewhere between 300 to up to approaching 400 for some of the lawyers. Now those aren't all active at once necessarily, so sometimes a case might get charged and resolved very quickly. Some cases hang out for a couple of years, and sometimes it's dependent on just the complexity, but also some defendants are interested in resolving and some are not. Yeah.
Well, one that has been hanging out for a while, a little over a year, and this is no longer under your jurisdiction, if you will, but it's the case against Jason Lindeman. He's accused of hitting, on July 9th of last year, the On the Loose, that's the name of it, paddle wheel boat. It had 44 people on board. He's accused of hitting it and then leaving the scene of the crime, not rendering aid, so on and so forth. He, of course, has pled not guilty to everything. And it's been taken out of your office. The State Attorney General's office is handling the prosecution of this. And I know you can't discuss even a little bit, probably, because it is an ongoing case, even though it's no longer yours. But I think people are frustrated because it's taking so long for this to, I mean, he just had a court appearance. We're taping this on the 24th of August, and he just had a court appearance earlier this week. There's not even a trial date set for this yet. And people say to me, why is this taking so long, Cheryl? And I'll say, I don't know. I don't work for the Attorney General's office. I don't know. But why do you think it's taking so long? Is it because it had to be taken out of your office for obvious, conflict of interest reasons and that kind of thing, even though it is being tried in this county?
Sure. Yeah, so going back to that, when it had first happened, our office was involved. Eventually, we determined that there was at least the appearance of a conflict, and that was something that just, anytime if there's an actual conflict or appearance of a conflict, it's not something that prosecutor's office wants to be involved with. We want to make sure that the public has trust in the process. Sure. And so we had asked Department of Justice to get involved. They took the case over. It had not yet been charged at that time, and it actually took a number of months before it got charged. Okay. And again, I'm not going into the facts of it, but just the procedural situation. It is it's a significant charge, and so this is something where those cases do tend to take a little bit longer. And there's a lot of evidence in that case that had to be gone through. There was on the front end, they didn't have everything figured out right away as far as their reconstruction or analysis, so that was something that caused a little bit of a delay initially. And then I think we've had cases that can take, I guess we had one go to trial relatively recently that took, I think it was about 3 years to get to trial.
What was that one?
And that was the Oshkosh West stabbing case.
Oh, yes,
and
yes.
That's not common that happens, but there are different factors that can play into that, and it's not always predictable. We had one actually just recently had a case that got resolved that I was handling that was just over 2 years. And so those things happen, and I think the more complex the case, the more likely it is.
Sure. Okay. And this also doesn't have anything specifically to do with your office, but I don't know that people are aware that there's, I mean, people everywhere are looking for help, right? I mean, you can't drive 1 square mile probably in the city or the county without, I mean, unless you're out in the country, without seeing a sign, help wanted, help wanted, help wanted. And with that shortage also comes a shortage of defense attorneys in our county, probably throughout the state, maybe even across the country, I don't know. But certainly cases in Winnebago County are getting delayed because defendants don't have defense attorneys. What kind of an impact does that have on your office when these cases keep getting moved back further and further?
Yeah.
Through no fault of the defendants, but
Sure.
It still has an effect on everybody, really.
Yeah, and it's definitely a statewide problem. And I think we've actually probably not had it as bad as some parts of the state. The northern and western parts of the state, I think, were hit even harder with this. And part of the issue is just a lack of defense attorneys in some of these areas that were interested in taking cases. Part of that, I think, comes from the pay situation, which was recently addressed in this year's budget. But the pay for prosecutors and for public defenders and the reimbursement rate for private lawyers taking cases that are public defender cases was quite low relative to other states. And so I think that for a long time had suppressed how many people were interested in that. And so there weren't enough lawyers to take cases. It got especially bad statewide over the last year or two. And the problem that it really created is you'd have people that were eligible for lawyers to have a lawyer appointed by the state and that they might not even have to pay for if they're public defender eligible. And a lot of them were in jail waiting for a lawyer to be appointed, and there just weren't lawyers to take those cases.
And so there they sit. Draining resources that could otherwise be spent on other things. And so much for we have a right to a speedy trial, right?
Yeah, and so it's a couple of issues. Really, one of them, it could be a financial burden shift. So if the state was going to pay for a lawyer, and now we're sitting there waiting for that to happen, there's another option that the county could pay for a lawyer. And in some cases, we had that happen here. I think that was even more common elsewhere. But where somebody was waiting for so long that the court said, this is too long, I'm going to appoint a lawyer. And the judge appointed a lawyer, but then the county would have to pay for it rather than the state. It also kept people in the jail longer in some cases. Yeah. That's a county expense as well.
Sure.
People's cases, and this was as far as the cases being drawn out at times, that impacts negatively not just the defendant, but potentially victims or other people that are involved in the case as well.
Yeah, it's just a real problem. So one thing I think that a lot of people don't really understand how this defense system works, and maybe you can just talk about it a little bit, even though you're with the DA's office. Anybody can sign up to be a defense lawyer, correct? Anyone who's in private practice, they can.
Sure.
It's not like, okay, I want a defense lawyer, I go to the yellow page, well, nobody goes to the yellow pages anymore, but I go to the internet and I search for defense attorneys, Winnebago County. They do have an office, I believe, right?
Yep, there is a state public defender's office in Oshkosh.
But then anyone in private practice, if they do criminal defense work, they can be on a list. It's a rotating list, as I understand it. At least it was. I don't know. Is it still?
I don't know exactly how it functions now. I think they'll just, if they can find somebody to take the case, they'll
well,
give it to them.
Yeah, that's probably true. But at least the way it used to work when
Yes.
things were not quite the way they are now, it was a rotating list. So anyone, you can call, if you need a defense lawyer, you can call anyone who does defense legal work. You don't have to call the public defender's office, but you can call them.
Right, so 3 different ways actually. So there's public defender, which there are certain lawyers that is what they do. They work for the state public defender. They're based in many different counties, but we have our office here of public defenders that generally cover Winnebago County cases. Actually, their office also covers Waushara County. They don't have their own public defender's office there. So they have at any time essentially one of their lawyers assigned to be covering Waushara County.
Okay.
If someone qualifies for a public defender, and there's an eligibility form that they go through to determine whether they qualify, and it's income based and income and assets. And then if they qualify, then the public defender's office either would appoint one of their lawyers from within their office, or if they, for whatever reason, can't do that, if there's a conflict or there aren't enough lawyers in the public defender's office, they can send it out to private lawyers, and the state would reimburse the private lawyers. And that's a rate that's set by the state. And that was one of the issues, is not only were the salaries for the state employed lawyers low, but the reimbursement rate was low, and people they were essentially doing charity work to take those cases.
Yeah.
Now, if
and
somebody,
no one wants to do that.
Yeah. Well, we were fortunate here that we did have a pretty good number of lawyers that did that, and I think for some of them, it really was charity that they just said, "Oh, a portion of my time is going to be spent this way."
Yeah.
But so the other things are there, and anybody can hire whatever lawyer they want to. So that's always an option. They can go, like you say, they can go search online, or if they know someone, they can hire a lawyer. And obviously that's probably not going to be free. But then there's something in between. There can be a county appointment, or sometimes called a dean appointment. And so if someone doesn't qualify for a public defender, they might qualify for a county appointment. So it's easier to qualify for. The county would essentially pay the lawyer, and then the defendant would have to get on a payment plan to pay back the county. So it's kind of essentially a loan in that respect. So three different ways that people would typically get lawyers.
Okay, excellent. Well, let's talk about some of these, which is how you and I actually started talking in the first place. I did an article for the Oshkosh Herald on some of the alternative programs that we have, like the drug court, the Safe Streets program, and that kind of thing. And the more we talked, the more I said, "Hey, Eric, have I got a deal for you? I want you to come on my show." So there are, and help me understand this first before we get into this, because on your website, which we have been, I hope, putting up throughout the show, and will continue to do so. And by the way, if you're listening to this on radio, the address for the county DA's office is www.co.winnebago.wi.us/district- not underscore, but hyphen attorney. And I'll say that again, and it's on the screen right now, but it's co.winnebago.wi.us/district-attorney. So you can go there and check these things out. But one of the things I noticed on your website, Eric, is there are two different links, and one is for alternative/diversion programs, and then there's another link simply for alternative programs. What's the difference between the two? And then I want to talk about the different things that are under each category.
Sure. Well, I noticed the website it didn't really even fit on the screen, so maybe that they need to restructure how they're doing those. But on
our screen?
It was a
that's
little too
interesting,
long.
because when we put it in, it looked like it fit,
okay.
But maybe they can fix that.
Maybe the monitor was just cutting it off. But actually, I don't even remember how exactly the website is laid out as far as what is grouped where. But there are a whole bunch of programs that are out there. A lot of them are things that are used when somebody gets in trouble in some way. And their case would come to our office. We're looking at what we should do with it. And the traditional things that are available for sentencing would be prison, jail, probation, or fine. I guess those are probably the normal alternatives. And over time, it's become more common, not just here, but in many places, to look at some sorts of alternatives that just have, in a lot of situations, more specialized ways to address the problems that we see that someone has. So when we have someone that comes in, if we're looking at them for a potential diversion, one of the first things we would do is have them do an assessment, and this is the same type of assessment that the Department of Corrections does when they're trying to figure out what sort of programming is appropriate for someone who's going on supervision, probation, or extended supervision. And so they go through this assessment, and that gives some insight into what somebody's needs are. What are the things that need to get fixed so that they stop coming into the criminal justice system or getting arrested?
Sure.
So that's one of the tools that we use. But also, we have information from the police report or that's provided by the people involved in the case. And so there are a whole bunch of programs that are out there. Some are for less serious cases where we might be, for example, I mentioned earlier the worthless checks program that we had going on.
Right.
That was to keep cases from even getting into the system or getting charged. Then there are some cases, kind of on the other extreme is the drug court, where that's something where somebody was looking at either a lengthy jail sentence or even a prison sentence, so quite a serious case. And so that's not something, drug court is used as a condition of supervision, so we essentially would say you're going to be on probation, or if somebody has already been in prison, they could be on extended supervision. And we'd say if you can complete this program, then you're not going into custody for a longer period of time. Right. But that's used for very serious cases. And so it's a spectrum. And each of the programs that's out there, it was kind of designed for different purposes, and so they are used for different levels of severity as well.
Sure. And I know also that one of the differences between alternative/diversion programs and simply alternative programs is one is the drug court, and along with that STOP, which Safe Streets Treatment Options Program, and then I guess, Winnebago Teen Court, Winnebago County Teen Court is also under that. And that's a program for youth ages 12 to 16 who've committed some kind of an ordinance violation or a misdemeanor crime. And do you guys decide who gets to participate in that, or is that more something that a judge would decide?
Right. So those programs, Teen Court specifically is run by Human Services.
Okay.
So they get referrals from different agencies. It could be from law enforcement, for example. They deal with probably most frequently somebody who's in middle school, but it could be high school. And if somebody gets in trouble, it's not tremendously serious, and they look at it, especially if somebody doesn't have prior police contacts, they might say, let's give this person a chance to avoid getting into the court system, even though it would have been the juvenile court system for those individuals. Sure. And so they send it along to the people at Human Services that deal with that. And they do an assessment, they set them up, and actually the way the teen court works is they have a jury of their peers deciding what their sentence is.
Oh,
and so a lot of the people in the
jury of your peers.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, there are people, a lot of them, some of them are volunteers, but a lot of them are people that have gone through that program. And as part of their sentence, they have to come and be on the jury.
Oh, wow.
So they listen to a presentation from basically from the family and other people involved in the case. There are some students, typically high schoolers, that are acting as lawyers for teen court.
Oh, wow.
And then there's a judge who could be a lawyer, might not be. So I know we have, I think, a couple of judges that volunteer to be teen court judges. We have a few people from my office that do it. I know we've had people from the public defender's office, probation agents, and various people that volunteer to do that.
Interesting.
So then the jury is juveniles, and they're deciding how many times does a person have to come back to be on the jury? How much community service do they have to do? Do they have to do some other special project or a writing assignment or something like that?
Do you ever, in a situation like that, Eric, see where, because they're juveniles trying to determine guilt or innocence, guilt or not guilt, and then deciding an appropriate sentence or punishment, do you ever see them, kind of slacking off and saying, I've been there, done that. I'm just, he or she doesn't really deserve much. Do you ever see that?
Maybe. I mean, so when I'm there as the judge, I definitely try to make it a point to get the jurors. I want the jurors to get involved and to ask questions, and so I put pressure on them. I say, I'm going to make it real awkward if you don't ask some questions here. Yeah. So usually they're fairly involved, but not always.
Okay.
And also with this program, the people that come in there, the juveniles that come into that program, have acknowledged their guilt, basically. Okay. And they're just saying, hey, they're coming before the teen court for the jury to decide what they have to do to avoid getting convicted.
Gotcha.
But they often do get into it.
Yeah.
And also they've gone through it, and they said, well, I got mine, now somebody else has to do something too.
Good point. Okay, well, let's talk about some of the programs that are under your office's jurisdiction and purview. One, of course, is the Failure to Pay Child Support Diversion Program. Tell us briefly about that.
Yeah, so one of the things, this was one that came about, I don't even remember, maybe 10 years ago or so. historically our approach to child support cases, you have somebody who has not paid child support for a long time. They might owe, just for example, $15,000 to the other parent, and the child support agency has been involved and has not been successful in getting that caught up. So when it gets to a certain point, when it's real bad, basically, they would send us a case and say, would ask for you to consider criminal charges against this person for not paying child support. Now, this goes to back to what you were talking about before, where this is kind of the ultimate crime of poverty, right? If somebody has money, they're probably paying their child support and they're not going to be in trouble for this. And so one of the things that's important there is it has to be somebody who is intentionally not paying support. So we're talking about people who just haven't bothered to try to work, or they have money and they're just not paying it for whatever reason. But what we saw was that the traditional approach was to put those people on probation. And we said, well, they clearly have some issues. Hopefully those issues can be addressed on probation. Probation is not, they're not specialized necessarily, and that wasn't a real efficient vehicle to get child support paid. And the Department of Corrections, I think appropriately pointed out a number of times, they're not a debt collection agency. That's not their primary focus. It's really rehabilitation. And so it wasn't a great fit, but we didn't have a great fit for it. And so what we said, and that's the way a lot of these came about, is we looked at it, we said, well, let's come up with something that makes more sense. And so what we put together was basically a set of guidelines to say who should be able to get into this. We want them to make some showing that they can pay this down before we put them in. They need to be making some effort. And then if that's going in the right direction, let's give them the opportunity to avoid a conviction. And failure to pay child support is a felony. It's a relatively low-level felony, but it's a felony. And a lot of the people that have come in on that don't have a prior felony conviction, so that's a big deal. So there's a huge incentive there for somebody to be compliant if they can be. And I think in a lot of situations, it's a matter of pushing somebody a little harder than they were pushed before to see if you can get compliance, and that's the effort there. It's to say, here's your incentive. If you don't do this, you're going to be convicted of a felony, and then that program essentially monitors and provides some assistance too with pursuing employment and keeping up with things.
You know, sometimes there just doesn't seem to be a good balance, I guess, in what is punishment possibly for one crime as opposed to another. Case in point, I read 2 different news articles this week on cases where 2 different people also, where they voted in 2 different states. Well, that's a big deal. I think that's a felony also. It's a big deal, and I don't mean to diminish it by anything of what I'm about to say, but one guy got 15 days in the county jail, another got 10 days in the county jail, or maybe it was 12. I think it was 10 and 15. But in any event, it was no more than 2 weeks. And yet you can have people committing crimes like not paying child support, and they may not see any jail time whatsoever. And I think that's a bigger crime than someone voting in 2 different states. Again, please don't send me hate mail. I think it's a big deal and certainly a crime. But I think not paying child support probably affects more people more directly than voting in 2 different states.
Yeah, well, and some people do end up going to jail for it. So I don't mean to say that just because these programs exist that everybody ends up off in them.
For a program.
Yeah, and
right?
if somebody, I mentioned before, they have to make some showing that they're getting on the right track. But if they don't, then probably they are going to spend some time in jail. But I think really one of the things that's going on there is there are certain situations where we end up prioritizing fixing things going forward versus what does somebody deserve for what they did already. Because sometimes those things end up at odds. And if we look at this for child support, a lot of times, if it's somebody who we think realistically now has the ability to pay, given the right incentives, I might sit down with the victim and say, okay, here's what we're looking at. Here are the options. Here's what we might be able to accomplish. And does that person deserve to sit some time in jail? In a lot of cases, yes. But that ultimately would be counterproductive to getting this victim the money that he or she is owed going forward. And so we're forced to make a choice. And a lot of times the victims are involved in making that choice too.
Sure. Okay. Post-charge drug diversion program. What's that all about?
Yeah. So we have a couple of, a few different drug programs. That one came about probably about 15 years ago now. That's a misdemeanor level program where we were seeing people come in for, at the time, it was probably about marijuana mostly, but also cocaine, other misdemeanor type drug possessions. And we were faced with alternatives of, well, if we wanted to address the drug problem, we could put them on probation. But then they have a conviction. It might have been their first criminal conviction. And a drug conviction comes with its own special penalties that could impact somebody's housing eligibility or educational options as far as getting financial aid. So that's a sensitive thing. We had a program that was available at that time for first-time offenders, just for general criminal activity, and so that was one way we could have given somebody a chance to avoid a conviction, but it didn't necessarily address the drug issue. And what we really wanted was something for when the people were appropriate for it to be able to offer both those things, the opportunity and the incentive to avoid a conviction, but also to force them, if they're going to do that, to address the drug issue. So we came up with some ideas for this. We wrote a grant. We got the grant, I think it was for 3 years. And what it involved essentially was random urinalysis testing.
Okay.
So each day, a person who's in the program would have to call, at the time it was just this phone number, and it was my voice on the recording saying, if you are one of these colors, you have a test today. And I had to remember every night at midnight to switch it over. Oh. We've come a long ways with the tech on that, and nobody has to do that anymore. It's more automated. But that was something where if they were able to show that they were testing clean for a long period of time, they were able to get the case dismissed to avoid conviction.
Sure.
But if they weren't, then they're exposed to those traditional penalties.
Sure. And this one I found interesting. It's kind of a similar type program, but it's specifically for UW Oshkosh students.
Yeah.
The UWO Drug Diversion Program. Talk to us briefly about
there were just a few variations. Mostly it looked pretty much the same. There were a few twists on that one that were kind of unique for students. I think one of the things when we had started it, the push was to keep the students' cases off of CCAP, so that was one of the differences there.
Okay.
But mostly it looked the same, but we worked with the university to structure it in a way that didn't have an overly negative impact for students.
Sure.
Now the other one that I don't know if it's even on the website because it's relatively new, something called the Sparr program, that's Stimulant and Opioid Addiction Recovery Program.
No, I don't see it here.
Yeah, so that's a relatively new one that rolled out about 2 years ago. Again,
and what does that stand for, Eric?
Stimulant and Opioid Addiction Recovery Program.
Okay.
Came out to a kind of nice acronym, but really it's used for, this is felony level possession cases, so possession of methamphetamine, possession of heroin, now possession of fentanyl is in that category too. Basically drugs that are dangerous and are killing people. And again, we had the traditional sentencing options available. The most natural one for those types of cases was probably probation, but the Department of Corrections doesn't necessarily have the resources to be doing urinalysis tests as frequently as would be necessary for these cases. And these are all Class I felonies. That's the lowest level of felony. So the Department of Corrections isn't necessarily viewing that as the most serious group of offenders. And so we wrote this grant, and the grant covers the testing, which is expensive. And it tests people every other day. So they're coming in, they're on a schedule, but they're on a schedule where it's so frequent that almost any use is going to get caught. And they have to be giving these tests. And what we said was basically they have to start it right away when their case gets charged. That's one of the differences with most of these programs. The case has to be closed first. And we talked before about how that can take a while.
Yeah.
But this program, because we were concerned about overdoses, we said we need it to start sooner. So if they're interested in that, they start it right when they get charged. And then they might not even have to enter a plea on the case if they're able to test clean and complete a couple other requirements for 90 days. Then their case can be dismissed just by them essentially showing us that they don't need further intervention.
Okay. Well, just the fact that you guys have had to start a new program like that says there's a huge problem here.
Yes.
There's a huge need for that kind of a program. And I'm just looking at the clock here. We don't have time to go into all the rest of these, but let's just talk in general, and folks can just go to the DA's website and look at the different programs, what they mean, what they do, and that kind of thing. What's the success rate of programs like this, and what kind of recidivism rate do you see?
Yeah, it varies, and that's one of the things that we are big on is evaluating programs. So, for example, that misdemeanor drug diversion program that you talked about, we don't want to continue doing something just because we, at one point in the past, thought it was a good idea. So we want to evaluate those programs, make sure they're working, make sure they're doing what we want them to do.
Sure.
And if they're not, get rid of them or change them.
Sure.
So for that program, for example, we partnered with UW Oshkosh to do an analysis of it. And we've done that a number of times with UW Oshkosh, and I guess on occasion with other partners as well, to evaluate programs. And what they found for that program was the outcomes as far as recidivism, were better than the traditional sentencing approaches. And I guess I don't have on hand exactly what the numbers turn out to be, but also the added benefit when we're looking at these things, we first look at recidivism or whatever measure is going to tell us whether it's quote unquote working. But then also we look at is there some other savings that's there? And in this case, we were accomplishing better outcomes and also avoiding giving people criminal records that didn't have them already.
Sure.
So we had a similar experience with the domestic violence diversion program and switching the type of counseling that was being offered for domestic violence. We got an evaluation done of that, and they looked at that versus the more traditional style of counseling and found it led to much better outcomes. And that, it takes some time before a program can be evaluated that way.
Sure.
But overall, what we've seen in a lot of these cases, and probably in all the ones that are still surviving, is better outcomes than the alternatives.
Sure.
But then it's a matter of making sure we're picking the right people and doing the best job we can at selecting who's appropriate for those programs versus who's just not a good risk and is more appropriate for traditional prosecution.
Yeah. And again, who qualifies for these programs it's done on a case-by-case basis, depending on the program and what that accused person is accused of doing.
Right, yeah.
Okay, all right. What other things in our last remaining minutes do you want people to know about the DA's office and the services that you guys provide to the people in Winnebago County?
Well, I guess first we're like we talked about, we're always trying to be thoughtful about what we're doing, and we know that when something happens that gets law enforcement involved and results in somebody being in jail or potentially in trouble, there are a lot of people that are impacted by that. And so we want to give a lot of thought to what the appropriate response is, and it's not just a formula. So there are decisions that are made on all these cases, and this is true not just for our office, but any prosecutor's office. And a lot of times when you make a decision and there are multiple people involved, it's going to result in at least one person not liking it.
Yeah.
And that happens. And so I guess one thing that we've tried to do, one thing that's been important to me is to be as transparent as we can about what types of programs that we're offering, what we're doing with cases. I think historically that's something we've had to focus on that even before I was in this position, but also to be efficient about what we're doing, and that's something that's when Christian Gossett was district attorney as well. Efficiency was a big thing for him, and also just the recognition that it's a different world now than it was 20 or 25 years ago. We have access to a lot more data. We need to be using that, or really we're not doing our jobs. So we need to use it in figuring out that how to deal with cases, not just based on intuition, but based on this collection of data from here and from other places that shows what happens when you do certain things with people.
Yeah.
So those are all things that we're trying to do, and they're fun to talk about in places like this.
All right, excellent. Well, I wish that we had had more time to talk about those things, but you also sent me your curriculum vitae, and I got to tell you folks, this is one hard-working gentleman, not only as a DA, but he does a lot of work within the county, within the city, within the state. And I think that as residents of Winnebago County, we can be very proud to have someone of this caliber representing our needs and our interests. So thank you for all that you do, and thank you for being here. I'll be reaching out to you again next year because I try to have candidates on. Not always successful, but I try to get folks on, and sometimes the timing just doesn't work out. But I will be reaching out to you next year to get you to come on and talk about your run for re-election. Or for election, I guess is the case may be, because
I guess so.
Since you were appointed. So,
I appreciate
but anyway,
that.
thank you for all you do, for everything that your office does.
I appreciate that.
You guys are very hardworking, and it's not an easy job, so thank you. And that is going to do it for us for this episode. Thank you very much for joining us. Thanks again to my guest. Thanks to my crew. And as always, thanks to you. We will see you next time. Until then, take good care. Keep your eye on us. We've got our eye on Oshkosh.